The first thing we're going to do with our hip rafter is mark the theoretical and overall lengths. And unlike a common rafter where we mark the theoretical and overall lengths on the face of our board, I'm going to mark on the top edge of my hip rafter. I'm going to hook the end of my rafter, or what will be my rafter, and make a mark on the top edge at my theoretical length, 37.5 inches. So here is 37.5. And then I will continue down and mark my overall length, 40 5/8 of an inch, and make a mark there. And now I'm just going to mark a line straight across at those 2 points. So I have my theoretical and my overall length. Remember, my tail is only 2 inches overhang. The next step I'm going to do is I'm going to cut back for the head of my hip rafter. So what I want to do to cut back the head of my rafter is determine the distance that I need from the center of my ridge intersection to the very tip of my cut rafter. And I can do that with a calculator. And here is the calculation that we're going to use. So to calculate the distance to cut back our head of our rafter, I'm going to type in my pitch, 8-inch pitch. And then I'm going to give the calculator a run that represents half the thickness of my ridge. Since my ridge is a 2x6 or 2x4, whatever it happens to be, it's 2x. I know a 2x4 is 1.5 inches thick. Half of 1.5 is 3/4. So my run, 3/4 inches, is part of the calculation that I will use to calculate my distance of my hip. So I've typed in 3/4, hit the run button, and then if I hit the hip valley button, it gives me a hip length of 1 3/16 inches. That will be the distance I will pull back from the end of my board to the very tip of my hip rafter. So I have my tape hooked on the end of my board, and remember, the end of my board represents the center of the hip ridge common rafter intersection. Here's what our hip ridge common rafter intersection looks like. The ridge is at the top of your screen. We have 2 hips going down at a 45-degree angle to the left and right, and we have 3 king common rafters. The center lines of each member converge into a single point that's on top of the ridge, centered on the ridge. When we calculated our top offset of our hip, what we were calculating was the distance from the center of that intersection to the very tip or point of the finished cut hip rafter, as shown in the drawing here. Since we're pulling back 1 3/16, I'm going to make a mark on the top edge of my hip rafter at 1 3/16 inches. I'll mark a line across the face at that point, across the top edge of my board, 1 3/16. And then what I want to do is I want to find the center of the thickness of my hip rafter. Since my hip rafter is a 2x, the center line should be at 3/4 inch. And I'll make a mark at that point, 3/4 on the center of my rafter. This point right here will be the very tip of my hip rafter. When we cut the top head cut of our hip rafter, I'm going to 45-degree cut down this side and plumb cut down the face here, and as well as on the opposite side, a 45-degree on the top edge and plumb cut on the opposite side. So I'm going to take my speed square and use it in this fashion to mark that 45-degree cut there, and flip it over, like so. So starting from the very end of my board, okay, center of my intersection of the top ends of all my rafters, I pull back by the distance that I calculated on my calculator. Okay, that distance will vary anywhere from about 1 1/16 up to 1 5/16 depending on your pitch. In this case, with an 8/12 pitch, that distance is 1 3/16. So that determines the long point of my hip rafter. I pull back 45 degrees for the top, and then just to kind of keep my plumb cuts in alignment, I'll mark a shoulder mark right there, like so that I can properly line up my 2 points to mark for my plumb cut. So this is the very top of my hip rafter. Now I can mark the face of my rafter. So my shoulder is to right there. I'm going to take my speed square. I'm going to slide that up to my mark on my shoulder. And I'm going to pivot my speed square to my 8/12 pitch for my hip valley scale. Okay, we are not using the common rafter scale for hips and valleys. We use the upper set of numbers for hips and valleys. So I'll pivot that to my 8/12 pitch, which is right there. There's my 8 mark. Okay, so once I've got that accurately located, I can draw my plumb line on the top end of my hip rafter. I can now do the opposite side in the same way. Line up my speed square, find my 8-inch angle on the top set of my speed square numbers, and draw my plumb line. Now we're ready to mark the bird's mouth for the seat and plumb cuts of the notch for the wall plate. And that will happen at the location of the theoretical length mark that we made. On a hip rafter, we need to understand how it's positioned on the outside corner of the wall plate. And it's positioned such that the center of the hip rafter is on the very outside corner of the wall. I'm going to mark the center line of this mark here, again at the 3/4, like I did on my head cut. So I have the center line of the top edge of my hip rafter, and this point right here now represents the very outside corner of the wall plate. And what I want to do is I want to draw the direction that the wall plate travels. So this point right here corresponds to this point on my wall plate. So if I can imagine my wall coming forward this way and that way, I want to draw my diagonal lines coming uphill of the hip rafter. So let's draw those 2 lines. So there's my reference point. I'll take my speed square again, and now going up to the top of my rafter, draw a 45-degree line up that way, flip my square over, draw a 45-degree line up that way, and again I'll just mark a line to represent the very shoulder cuts. So again, this was my original theoretical line. I found the center of my theoretical line. This center point represents the very outside corner of the wall plate. I drew a line representing the direction that the wall plate was traveling, in this case uphill of the hip rafter, and then I marked a line across so that I could register my 2 lines. So I'm going to lay my hip rafter down on its side, And now I'm ready to mark the plumb cut for the bird's mouth. Mark 2 sets of lines. I'm going to start here and set my angle to my 8/12 pitch. There's my 8/12. And draw a plumb line. And I'm also going to draw one more plumb line back here at my 8/12 pitch. Right there. Okay, so I have 2 plumb lines for my bird's mouth cut. And why do I have 2 plumb lines? The first, or the uphill plumb line, will be where I measure my height above plate. So again, for reference, here is the very outside corner of my wall plate. This line right here actually represents the edge of my wall. If you imagine a plane coming up the face of my wall here, that is our edge of our wall. So our line is following the wall there. We want to measure our height above plate at this uphill line so that when we install our common rafters, those height above plates match. So I'm going to mark my height above plate of 2.5 inches on this uphill line. When I cut, I'm actually going to cut my seat cut all the way back to my back line, or my downhill line. That's going to ensure that I cut enough to clear the very outside corner. So I'm going to take a square or a tape measure, and I'm going to measure at the uphill line my height above plate. So 2.5 inches would be right there, and I'm going to mark my square line through that point. I'll flip my square over, and remember, I'm going to mark and cut to my back line through that 2.5 inch height above plate. I will line one edge of my square up with this back line here and mark my seat cut. So my bird's mouth now consists of my seat cut and my plumb cut going through the plane here of the wall, where this mark here is my height above plate. The forward line is my height above plate, 2.5 inches. Now we're ready to mark the tail. And the tail is a similar process to the mark I did at my theoretical line. I'm going to start at the center, and I'm going to draw 2 lines, 2 45-degree lines forward. So we'll mark the center again at 3/4, since my hip is a 2.5, since it's a 2x or 1.5 thick. So that is the center. I'll flip my speed square over, use the 45-degree line, start from my center point, and come uphill towards the top end of my rafter and mark a 45-degree line, and do the same on the other side, uphill. And then again, I'll mark for the shoulder so I can line up my 2 plumb cuts on either side. Notice that the top end, the arrow points up, and on the bottom end, the arrow points down. So I have opposing 45-degree outside corner cuts. So now to complete the marks for my tail cut, I'm going to lay my rafter, my hip rafter, on the side. And using my speed square aligned with the mark that I made at the 2 shoulders, angle my square so that I have my 8/12 hip pitch and mark a plumb line. Notice this line and these lines are all parallel. Okay, they should always be parallel, as well as the top cut. The top cut will also be parallel with these lines. I also need to mark the opposite side for my plumb line, which is going to go down that way. So I'll make a mark here use my speed square, the same angle as all the other plumb lines, like so. And there you can see my line should line up relative to that mark across the top.